The mysterious encounter. The city was silent. Buildings stood like broken shadows against the pale moonlight, their walls scared by war. Cracks ran along the streets, and the wind carried the distant echoes of battle. The war between humans and the alien invaders had left the world in ruins. John stumbled forward, clutching his side. His uniform was torn, and blood soaked through his fingers. His breathing was ragged, each step heavier than the last. Somewhere behind him, the rest of his unit had retreated, but John had been too slow. Now he was alone. A sharp pain shot through his leg, forcing him to kneel against a crumbling wall. He gritted his teeth, scanning the area for movement. His rifle lay useless beside him, broken during the last ambush. The only weapon he had now was a small knife, but he doubted it would help against the enemy. The aliens, known as the Xilari, were unlike anything humanity had ever faced. Tall, slender, with glowing eyes and strange technology, they moved silently across battlefields, taking down entire squads without a sound. John had seen them up close once, and it was a memory he wished he could forget. Now, sitting alone in the ruins, he wondered if this was how his story would end. As he leaned his head back against the wall, something shifted in the distance, a faint crunch of gravel. John's eyes narrowed. His hand instinctively gripped the knife. He held his breath, listening carefully. The sound grew closer, soft but deliberate, like footsteps. John pressed himself against the shadows, trying to disappear into the darkness. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. He could see the faint outline of someone standing at the edge of the broken street. Was it a Xilari soldier? His heart pounded as he braced for the worst. But then, as the figure stepped forward into the moonlight, John's eyes widened. It was not what he expected. A young girl, no older than 14, stood in front of him. Her skin glowed faintly under the night sky, a soft silver light radiating from her hands. Her large violet eyes blinked curiously as she gazed at him. She was not human, but she did not look like the other Xilari warriors either. John's grip on the knife loosened. This alien child didn't seem dangerous, at least not in the way he had feared. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the girl took a cautious step forward, raising her hand slightly. The glow around her palms brightened, casting a gentle light over John's injuries. "What are you doing?" John rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't respond. She knelt beside him, her small fingers hovering over the wound on his side. The light from her hands pulsed softly, and to John's surprise, the pain began to fade. A warm sensation spread through his body, as if her touch was stitching him back together. John's breathing slowed. His mind raced with questions, but he was too exhausted to speak. The girl worked silently, her expression calm and focused. John could see now that her clothing was different from the usual Xilari soldiers. She wore a simple cloak made of shimmering fabric, and strange symbols glowed faintly along the edges. "Why are you helping me?" John asked, forcing himself to stay conscious. The girl met his gaze but didn't answer. Instead, she glanced around nervously, as if checking for danger. John followed her gaze. In the distance, faint lights flickered through the ruins. Xilari patrols. The girl placed a finger to her lips, signaling for him to stay quiet. John nodded, understanding her silent warning. Despite the danger, she stayed by his side until his wounds had healed enough for him to stand. When John rose to his feet, he swayed slightly, but the pain was gone. He stared at the girl in disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. The girl gave a small nod, but quickly pointed toward a nearby alley, urging him to follow. John hesitated for a brief moment, glancing at the patrol lights growing closer. Trusting an alien felt strange, almost impossible, but she had saved his life. Right now, she might be his only chance to survive. With a deep breath, he followed her into the shadows. As they slipped through the ruins, John couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious girl was. She didn't seem like the enemy. In fact, something about her felt different. But there was one thing he knew for sure. This was only the beginning. The alien's healing touch. The tunnels beneath the city stretched endlessly, weaving through the ruins like forgotten veins of a once-living world. The air was damp and thick with silence, broken only by the soft echo of footsteps. John followed the alien girl closely, his eyes darting to every shadow, every crack along the walls. The glow from the girl's skin illuminated the path just enough to see, casting strange, flickering patterns along the stone. John couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an escape route. It felt ancient, as if these tunnels had existed long before the war began. "Who are you?" John finally asked, his voice low but firm. The girl glanced at him but said nothing. Her violet eyes reflected curiosity, but there was hesitation, like she was carefully choosing what to reveal. John sighed. He didn't expect much of an answer. Whatever her reason for helping him, he owed her his life. His wounds, which had once burned with every breath, now felt like distant memories. His thoughts drifted back to the moment she healed him. He remembered the warmth of her touch, the strange hum that filled the air as her hands glowed over his injuries. It wasn't just medical treatment. There was something deeper, something beyond human understanding. "Are you one of them?" John tried again. "The Xilari." This time, she stopped walking. Her head tilted slightly, and for the first time she spoke. "Xere," she said, pressing her hand gently against her chest. "Not like them." John blinked. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but the weight behind those few words felt heavy. "So, you're not with the ones attacking us." Xere shook her head. She began walking again, motioning for him to follow. John frowned but stayed close behind. If she wasn't like the others, then why was she here? And why risk helping a human, an enemy? As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the walls began to change. Carvings lined the stone, glowing faintly under Xere's light. Symbols that looked ancient and unreadable stretched across the length of the corridor. John ran his fingers over one of the carvings. "This isn't Xilari tech," he murmured. Xere nodded, her expression calm but distant. Before John could ask more, the faint hum of something mechanical echoed from the tunnel behind them. His heart jumped. "Stay down," he whispered, pushing himself against the wall. Xere followed his lead, crouching beside him. The sound grew louder. Footsteps. The soft glow of red lights flickered at the far end of the tunnel. Xere's eyes narrowed as she placed her hand on the ground, the light from her skin dimming until they were nearly invisible. John tightened his grip on the small knife at his belt, though he knew it wouldn't be enough against a Xilari patrol. The figures passed slowly, their armor reflecting the faint red glow as they moved in formation. John held his breath. Xere's hand rested gently on his shoulder, signaling him to stay still. The patrol lingered for a moment, scanning the area with small hovering drones. John's pulse quickened as one of the drones drifted dangerously close to their position. Just as it was about to sweep past them, Xere raised her hand, and a faint pulse of energy rippled outward. The drone flickered, sputtering briefly before shutting down entirely. John's eyes widened in disbelief. The patrol seemed unaware of the disruption and continued forward, eventually disappearing into the depths of the tunnel. Xere exhaled softly, standing once the coast was clear. John followed suit, his mind racing. "You shut it down," he said, staring at the deactivated drone in the distance. "How?" Xere didn't answer. Instead, she pressed forward, her pace slightly faster now. John hurried after her. He wanted answers, but he could sense the urgency in her movements. Whatever she was leading him toward, it was important. After several minutes, they arrived at a large chamber. It was unlike anything John had seen. The room opened up into a vast underground space, with glowing roots stretching from the ceiling to the floor. Pools of shimmering blue liquid dotted the area, casting reflections along the walls. Xere stepped carefully into the chamber, motioning for John to stay close. "This place," John began, trailing off as he took in the strange beauty of the underground sanctuary. "It's incredible." Zira knelt by one of the pools, dipping her fingers into the glowing water. A series of soft, melodic hums filled the chamber, as if the water itself was alive and responding to her touch. John watched in awe. "Is this why you brought me here?" Zira stood, stepping toward him with cupped hands. In her palms rested a small droplet of the glowing liquid. Without hesitation, she pressed it against his chest. The droplet seeped into his skin, and suddenly, John felt a surge of warmth spread through his body. His vision sharpened, and the fatigue he had carried began to fade. "What is this?" he asked, breathless. Zira smiled faintly. "Life." John stared at her, realizing for the first time that this girl, this alien, was more than just a healer. She was something far greater. But even as the warmth filled him, John couldn't shake the feeling that this sanctuary wasn't just a place of peace. It was a hidden world, a secret that others, both human and Silari, would kill to uncover. And now, he was a part of it, the escape through the unknown. The air in the tunnel felt heavier the deeper they went. John kept close to Xera, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness behind them. The faint hum of alien patrols had disappeared, but an uneasy silence took its place. Xera moved with quiet confidence, her glowing hands gently brushing against the tunnel walls, as if she could feel something hidden beneath the stone. John watched her carefully. There was something strange about the way she navigated the tunnels, like she wasn't just walking, but listening. The path twisted and turned, leading them further underground. The deeper they went, the more the surroundings began to shift. At first, the walls were rough and jagged, made of cracked stone, but as they descended, the stone smoothed into a sleek, glassy surface that reflected Xera's light in strange patterns. John slowed his steps, brushing his hand along the wall. "What is this place?" he muttered. Xera paused, tilting her head as if trying to find the right words. "Old," she said simply. "Before war." John raised an eyebrow. "Before the war? You mean before the Xilari arrived?" Xera nodded but said nothing more. As they continued forward, John couldn't shake the feeling that these tunnels were older than even humanity's first cities. The carvings along the walls grew more elaborate, glowing softly as if the stone itself remembered their presence. Strange symbols, resembling both Silari language and something more ancient, spiraled along the path. The silence stretched on until John finally broke it. "Where are we going?" Xera stopped in front of a large doorway carved directly into the tunnel's wall. The frame shimmered faintly under her light, and faint energy rippled through the air. "Safe place," she said, pressing her hand against the doorway. A soft vibration hummed beneath her palm, and slowly the stone parted to reveal a hidden passageway. John hesitated, peering inside. The room beyond the door was unlike anything he had seen. Massive roots, glowing with the same blue energy as the pools in the previous chamber, hung from the ceiling. The floor was covered in soft moss that pulsed gently beneath their feet. At the center of the chamber stood a tall, crystalline structure that radiated light, illuminating the space in a soft, ethereal glow. John stepped inside cautiously. "Is this some kind of sanctuary?" Xera moved toward the crystal, placing her hand against its smooth surface. "Heart of this place," she said softly, "keeps the tunnels alive." John crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the wall. "You know, you're going to have to explain more than just a few words at some point." Xera glanced over her shoulder, offering a faint smile. Before John could press further, a sudden tremor rattled the chamber. Dust and small stones shook loose from the ceiling, and John instinctively reached for his knife. Xera's eyes narrowed, and she pressed her ear to the wall, listening carefully. "They found us," John muttered, his muscles tensing. Xera shook her head. "Not them." John frowned. "Then what?" Before she could answer, a low growl echoed from one of the darkened tunnels leading away from the chamber. The sound was deep and unnatural, like metal scraping against stone. John took a step back, eyes narrowing toward the source. Sarah's expression darkened, and she quickly grabbed his wrist, pulling him toward another exit on the far side of the chamber. "What was that?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't answer, but her grip tightened. They slipped through a narrow passageway, leaving the crystal chamber behind. The tunnel ahead was narrow, forcing John to crouch slightly as they moved. The growl behind them grew louder, reverberating through the walls. "Okay, I'm guessing that wasn't one of your people," John muttered, keeping his voice low. Zira shook her head, her pace quickening. As they moved deeper, the tunnel began to widen, opening into another large chamber. This one, however, wasn't like the sanctuary. The air was cold, and the walls were lined with strange metallic structures that hummed faintly. John slowed his steps, staring at the strange devices embedded into the stone. "What is this place?" Zira hesitated. "Burial ground," she said softly. John's eyes narrowed. "Burial ground for who?" Before she could respond, the growl returned, this time closer. John turned sharply, gripping his knife as a dark figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the chamber. Its body was twisted and skeletal, with glowing red eyes that pierced through the darkness. "What the hell is that?" John took a step back, placing himself slightly in front of Zira. "Forgotten," Zira whispered, her eyes locked on the creature. The creature took a slow step forward, its jagged limbs scraping against the stone floor. John could see faint traces of Silari technology grafted onto its body, but the rest of it looked ancient, like it had been waiting in the dark for centuries. Zira raised her hand, the glow from her skin intensifying. The creature halted, tilting its head as if recognizing her presence. John tightened his grip on his knife. "Can you stop it?" Zira's gaze hardened. "Maybe." The creature let out another growl, stepping closer despite Zira's light. John braced himself. "Guess we'll find out." Secrets of the alien world. The passage twisted and narrowed as John and Zira pressed forward, the soft hum of the tunnels echoing beneath their footsteps. Behind them, the faint growl of the creature faded into the distance, but John's grip on his knife remained tight. He didn't trust the silence. Zira led him deeper, her glowing hands brushing the walls as if she could feel the pulse of the tunnels. Every so often, she would pause, placing her palm flat against the stone and listening carefully. John watched with quiet curiosity, realizing that these tunnels weren't just pathways. They were alive in some way. The further they traveled, the more the environment began to change. The sleek, glass-like stone walls shifted into something stranger. Veins of glowing blue energy pulsed through the surface, forming patterns that resembled neural pathways. It reminded John of a living organism, breathing beneath the surface. "What is this place?" John finally asked, his voice low. Zira paused, turning to face him. "Old home," she said softly, her gaze drifting along the glowing patterns. "Before war. Before them." John narrowed his eyes. "Them? You mean the Xilari?" Zira hesitated. "Some Xilari. Not all." John exhaled slowly, leaning against the wall. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or more concerned. "So let me get this straight. Some of your kind are the enemy, but not you." Zira nodded, her expression unreadable. John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not making this easy to understand, you know." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Zira's mouth. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but John caught it. Before he could say anything else, Zira gestured for him to follow. They entered a massive chamber, larger than any they had passed before. Towering crystalline structures jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, glowing faintly beneath the ceiling of hanging roots. Pools of shimmering liquid dotted the floor, casting moving reflections along the walls. John stepped forward cautiously, his eyes drawn to the crystal formations. They hummed softly, vibrating with an energy he couldn't explain. "What is this place?" he asked again, his voice echoing softly. Zira knelt beside one of the pools, dipping her hand into the liquid. A series of glowing symbols appeared on the surface, rippling outward like water disturbed by a stone. "Memory," she said quietly. John raised an eyebrow. "Memory." Zira nodded, motioning for him to come closer. Reluctantly, John crouched beside her, staring at the glowing symbols. The patterns shifted and changed, forming shapes and figures that resembled scenes from a distant past. The images told a story of peace, of a world untouched by war. Strange cities stretched across the landscape, with towers of light reaching toward the sky. Zira's kind lived alongside humans, sharing knowledge and technology. But then, the images darkened. A shadow crept across the land, consuming the cities one by one. The peaceful Xilari were replaced by warlike figures, their glowing eyes burning with a fierce intensity. John recognized them immediately, the Xilari soldiers he had fought against. The scene ended abruptly, the pool returning to a still, glass-like surface. John stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "So, what happened? What changed?" Zira's gaze lowered. "They took control. Those who resisted hid." John glanced around the chamber. "Is that what this place is? A hiding spot?" Zira nodded. "Safe for now, but not forever." John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "So, let me guess, you're part of the group that didn't want war." Zira's eyes met his. "Yes." John leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. "And now you're risking your life to help someone like me." Zira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she touched her chest lightly, just over her heart. "Because you are different." John frowned. "Different how?" Zira's gaze softened, but she didn't elaborate. Before John could press further, a sudden vibration rippled through the chamber. The crystals shuddered, and the pools of liquid trembled as if disturbed by an unseen force. Zira's eyes narrowed, and she stood quickly. "What now?" John asked, rising to his feet. Zira pointed toward one of the smaller tunnels leading out of the chamber. "We must go. They are close." John tensed, gripping his knife. "The Xilari." Zira hesitated. "No. Worse." John's heart sank at the way she said it. They moved swiftly through the tunnel, the glow from Zira's hands illuminating their path. The further they traveled, the more John's mind raced. What could be worse than the Xilari soldiers? His question was answered moments later. As they emerged into another chamber, John froze. In the distance, dark figures moved slowly through the shadows. They were twisted and deformed, with jagged limbs that scraped against the stone. Their glowing red eyes pierced through the dark, scanning the area methodically. John felt his breath catch in his throat. "What the hell are those?" Zira's voice was barely a whisper. "Forgotten ones. Not Xilari. Not human." John tightened his grip on his weapon, even though he knew it wouldn't do much against creatures like this. Zira stepped forward, raising her glowing hand. The light from her skin intensified, casting a bright wave that washed over the chamber. The creatures recoiled, hissing as they disappeared into the shadows. John exhaled in relief but kept his knife close. "We must hurry," Zira said, glancing over her shoulder. "They do not stay away for long." John followed, but his mind was spinning. This war wasn't just about humans and Xilari. Something far older and far more dangerous lurked beneath the surface, and somehow he had become part of it. The Fragile Alliance. The tunnel walls pressed in around them, the air growing colder with each step. John's heart pounded as he followed Zira through the narrow passage. The glow from her hands illuminated the jagged stone, casting shifting shadows that danced along the walls. Behind them, the faint echoes of the Forgotten Ones lingered, creatures born from the ruins of an ancient war, twisted by time, and something darker. John couldn't stop thinking about them. "Zira," John whispered, keeping his voice low. "What are those things?" They're not like your people. Zira slowed, her hand lightly grazing the wall, as if feeling for something beneath the surface. They were once like us, she said softly. Long ago, before the war began. But they changed. John frowned. Changed into that. Zira's violet eyes flickered with something close to sorrow. Corrupted by something beneath this world. The more they stayed, the more they became less. John exhaled sharply, running his hand through his hair. Great. So now we're dealing with monsters and auxiliary soldiers. Zira glanced at him. They are not monsters. They are what happens when war never ends. Her words hung heavy in the air, and John didn't press further. The tunnel finally opened into another chamber, smaller than the last, but just as strange. Glowing roots stretched across the floor, twisting around crystalline formations that pulsed softly with light. Zira knelt by one of the crystals, placing her palm against it. Symbols appeared along the surface, spreading out in gentle ripples. John watched from a distance, keeping his knife at the ready. So, what are you doing now? Calling for help. Sarah replied, not looking up. We are close, but not safe. John raised an eyebrow. Close to what? Zira hesitated for a moment before answering. To others like me. John straightened. Wait, there are more you down here. Zira nodded. Few, but they know the way. John exhaled in relief. As much as he appreciated Zira's help, the thought of more friendly faces, alien or not, was welcome. But his relief was short-lived. A faint noise echoed through the tunnel behind them. John's muscles tensed, and he turned sharply, his eyes scanning the darkness. It was subtle at first, a distant clicking, like claws tapping against stone. Slowly, it grew louder. They're coming, John muttered, gripping his knife. Zira's gaze darkened. They will not stop. Then let's move, John urged. Zira rose quickly, leading John through another narrow passageway. The clicking grew louder, now accompanied by faint growls that reverberated through the stone. John's mind raced. The creatures hadn't attacked yet, but he had a sinking feeling that whatever fragile piece Zira's light had bought them wouldn't last. The tunnel opened into another cavern, but this time, something was different. A group of figures stood waiting near the center, their silhouettes bathed in the faint glow of crystalline formations. John slowed, gripping his knife tightly. Friends of yours. Zira stepped forward, her hands raised in greeting. The figures lowered their weapons and approached carefully. One of them, taller than the rest, removed their hood, revealing a face similar to Zira's but older, with scars running across his skin. His eyes glowed faintly, narrowing as he studied John. Zira exchanged words with the older alien in her native tongue, soft, melodic, but sharp at times. John remained silent, his gaze flicking between them. Finally, the older alien stepped closer, his gaze locked onto John. You are human, he said, his voice deep and cautious. John straightened, meeting his eyes. Yeah, and I'm guessing you're not. The alien's expression didn't change, but his posture relaxed slightly. Zira has brought you here. That means she trusts you. John glanced at Zira, who gave him a small nod. I trust her too, John said quietly. The older alien studied him for another moment before speaking again. The Forgotten Ones will not stop. They are drawn to humans more than to us. If you stay here, they will find you. John's grip tightened around his knife. I've noticed. Zira stepped closer to John. He can help, she said to the others. The older alien's gaze hardened. A human cannot help in this war. John smirked faintly. You'd be surprised what humans can do when their backs are against the wall. There was silence for a moment before the older alien finally nodded. Perhaps. The conversation ended abruptly as another tremor shook the chamber. The crystals pulsed violently, and distant growls echoed through the tunnels. They are here, the older alien said sharply. We must move. Now. Zira took John's hand, and led him quickly alongside the others. As they navigated through the tunnels, John couldn't help but feel like he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was part of something far bigger. And somehow, he knew this alliance, fragile as it was, might be the only chance either of their species had to survive. The cost of friendship. The tunnels twisted deeper into the earth, spiraling downwards in a path that felt older than the war itself. John kept close to Xera, his senses on edge. The presence of the Forgotten Ones lingered behind them, like shadows refusing to fade. The group of Silari rebels moved silently, their footsteps synchronized in an eerie rhythm. John could feel the tension in the air, the kind that whispered of danger just out of sight. He stole a glance at Xera, who walked a few paces ahead. Her glowing hands traced the walls as they walked, leaving faint streaks of light behind them. "She does that to keep the path closed," one of the Silari whispered beside him. Noticing John's curious stare, the alien's voice was calm but firm. "Closed," John echoed, raising an eyebrow. The Silari nodded toward the streaks of light. The Forgotten cannot pass through sealed tunnels. John's gaze drifted to the glowing marks. "Smart. They were designed long ago, when we first fled below," the alien explained quietly. John frowned. "Fled from what?" "The war." The Silari's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, from them." John didn't need to ask who. The memory of those red eyes still burned fresh in his mind. As they moved further, the air grew warmer, thick with the scent of moss and something metallic. The tunnel eventually opened into a wide cavern, larger than any they had passed before. A vast underground lake stretched across the floor, its surface shimmering with faint blue light. Crystalline structures jutted from the ceiling, dripping slow streams of glowing liquid into the water below. Xera led John toward the edge of the lake, kneeling by the water. She cupped her hands and submerged them beneath the surface. When she pulled them out, droplets of the glowing liquid clung to her skin like tiny stars. John crouched beside her. "What is it?" Xera stared at the droplets for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Life. This keeps us strong, but at a cost." John's brow furrowed. "A cost?" Xera hesitated, then extended her hand toward John's chest. The droplets slid from her fingers, seeping into his skin. A sudden warmth spread through his body, erasing the lingering fatigue from his muscles. His senses sharpened, and for a brief moment, he felt more alive than he had in years. But when John looked back at Xera, he noticed her shoulders slumping slightly. The light that once glowed brightly in her palms dimmed. "Wait," John said, stepping back. "Did that just take something from you?" Xera didn't meet his gaze. "The light gives, but also takes." John's eyes narrowed. "You mean it's draining you every time you use it?" Xera nodded faintly. John exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Xera, you've healed me twice now. How much of your energy did that cost?" Xera's gaze softened, but she didn't answer. Before John could press further, the older Xilari who had spoken to him earlier approached. "You must understand," the elder said, standing tall beside them. "Xera's power is rare. Few of our kind can wield it." John's eyes hardened. "And you just let her burn herself out like this?" The elder's gaze flickered toward Xera, then back to John. "It is her choice. She uses it to save lives, human and Silari alike." John's jaw tightened. He turned back to Xera, lowering his voice. "You can't keep doing this, Kaitire. Whatever this is, this gift you have, if you keep using it, it's going to kill you." Xera smiled faintly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Not yet." John opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden tremor shook the cavern. The lake rippled violently, and distant growls echoed from the tunnels they had passed. The elder Xilari tensed. "They are here." John's pulse quickened. "The Forgotten." The elder nodded. "They have found us." Xera stood, her glow returning faintly. John gritted his teeth. We can't fight them, can we? No, the elder said grimly. But we can delay them long enough to escape. The Xilari warriors moved quickly, forming defensive positions around the chamber. Zira, however, stayed by John's side. I can hold them back, she said softly. John shook his head. No, not this time. Zira's eyes met his, confusion flickering across her face. John stepped closer. You've done enough for me already. You don't need to drain yourself for this fight. Zira hesitated, but the growls grew louder. The shadows at the edge of the tunnel shifted. John's grip tightened on his knife. Come on, he said, motioning toward the far side of the lake. Let's get out of here before. A piercing shriek cut through the air. One of the Forgotten Ones lunged from the shadows, its jagged limbs scraping against the stone floor. Before John could react, Zira raised her hand, sending out a pulse of blinding light. The creature screeched, stumbling back into the tunnel. John stared at her, wide-eyed. I thought you weren't going to. Zira's knees buckled slightly, and John caught her before she could fall. Damn it, Zira, he muttered, steadying her. The elder Xilari approached swiftly. We must move now, he said. The light won't hold them for long. John lifted Zira gently, supporting her as they hurried toward the far exit. As they fled deeper into the tunnels, John couldn't shake the sinking feeling that Zira's gift was both their salvation and their greatest threat. And with every use, it brought her closer to the edge, a link beyond understanding. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching on like veins beneath the earth. John carried Zira in his arms, her weight light but unsettling. Her glow had faded to the faintest flicker, and her skin, once vibrant and warm, now felt cold against his chest. Behind them, the Forgotten Ones still lingered, their guttural growls echoing through the winding paths like distant thunder. The elder Xilari led the way, his eyes fixed forward, as if guiding them by memory alone. John's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what he had witnessed. Zira had burned herself again to protect them, and this time she hadn't recovered as quickly. Zira, John whispered, glancing down at her pale face. Stay with me. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely. The violet light in them flickered weakly. I am still here, she murmured. John exhaled sharply, relieved but frustrated. You don't have to keep doing this. You can't keep saving me at your own expense. Zira's gaze softened. I do not regret it. John clenched his jaw, shifting her slightly in his arms as they continued forward. The elder Xilari finally stopped at the entrance of another large chamber, but this one was different. A towering structure, half organic and half machine, rose in the center of the cavern. It pulsed softly with blue light, and long crystalline roots stretched out from its base, winding into the walls and ceiling. The air hummed with energy, vibrating faintly against John's skin. What is this? John asked, lowering Zira carefully onto the moss-covered floor. The elder stepped forward, placing his hand against the crystalline structure. Symbols flickered to life across its surface, pulsing in response to his touch. This is the heart spire, the elder said, his voice low with reverence. It connects the tunnels, connects us all. It will shield her, but only for a time. John knelt beside Zira, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. Shield her how? The elder's eyes met John's. The heart spire shares its energy, but it cannot heal what she has already given away. She needs rest. Time. John's gaze darkened. And if the Forgotten find this place? They won't, the elder replied. Not yet. John pressed his palms against the cool ground, trying to push down the growing frustration in his chest. That's not good enough, he muttered. The elder studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You care deeply for her. John's jaw tightened. She saved my life. More than once. The elder knelt beside Zira, his hands hovering over her as faint light streamed from the heart spire into her chest. Slowly, The pale tint of her skin began to fade, replaced by a soft glow. "But this connection between you," the elder said quietly. "It is more than gratitude." John's eyes flicked toward the elder. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be dragged into a war or hunted by things I don't understand." The elder's gaze remained steady. "And yet, you stayed." John looked away, unable to argue. Zira stirred slightly, her hand brushing against John's. The warmth that spread from her touch wasn't the same draining sensation he had felt before. It was something gentler, as if she was grounding herself to him. "I stayed because she did," John admitted finally. The elder auxiliary's eyes softened, and he nodded. "Perhaps there is more strength in that than you realize." Suddenly, the chamber trembled. The light of the heart spire flickered, and the crystalline roots shifted restlessly, as if sensing something nearby. The elder rose swiftly. "They are searching," he said grimly. "We must hurry." John helped Xira sit up, her breathing steadier but her movements slow. "We can't outrun them forever," John said. "No," the elder agreed. "But perhaps we don't need to." John frowned. "What do you mean?" The elder approached the heart spire again, pressing his palm against it. The crystals responded, glowing brighter as symbols spiraled outward. "There is a way to end this, but it requires both of you," the elder said, his gaze lingering on John and Xira. Xira sat up straighter, her eyes locked onto the heart spire, as if understanding the elder's words before he even spoke them. "What kind of way?" John asked warily. The elder's expression darkened. "A link, one that bridges human and Silari. It has only been attempted once, long ago. But if successful, it could sever the Forgotten's hold on these tunnels." John's breath caught. "A link? Between us?" Xira's gaze met his. "Yes." John hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "And if it fails?" The elder's eyes dimmed slightly. "If it fails, the link could drain you both beyond saving." John swallowed hard. "Great." Xira slowly stood, stepping closer to the heart spire. She turned to John, offering her hand. "I will not ask you to do this," she said softly. "But if you choose to, I will stand with you." John looked at her, studying the way her hand trembled slightly yet her eyes held no fear. With a deep breath, he placed his hand in hers. The heart spire flared to life, its light engulfing them both. A surge of energy coursed through John, unlike anything he had ever felt. Memories, not his, but Xira's, flooded his mind. He saw the war from her eyes, the loss of her people, and the quiet defiance she carried every day. And beneath it all, he felt the faint thread that connected them, something fragile, yet unbreakable. As the light intensified, the Forgotten's distant growls faded into silence. John's grip tightened around Xira's hand, and for the first time, he felt that the war, this war, could finally end.